example, like Marcos dynasty, where they have very, very strong voter base in metropolitan, Manila area, and for example, the Duterte, where they actually have, for example, much more regional, for example, Mindanao area, which is very distant, and they have a very different political and cultural background like that. So I think I'm going to structure my speech in two ways. The first thing is I'm going to explain as to why, for example, the meaningful cooperation between these two political parties is not going to happen, and therefore things like political coalition is unlikely to happen, and show as to why under their set of house. If different, for example, president and vice president are elected together, probably that leads to significant political inefficiency. But secondly, I'm just going to be very charitable and just assume that coalition happens to some extent, but still explain to you as to why that necessarily leads to a worse outcome under their side, and why under our side of the house, at least better form of political cooperation is going to happen. The first thing, therefore, is about why coalition is not a viable option, and why this leads to political inefficiency. There are many reasons why coalition is unlikely to happen. The first is because, as I have explained, there is a very different voting bloc that you have to appeal to. Because, for example, historically speaking, for example, the Manila voters have been so much loyal, and Luzon voters have been so much loyal to, for example, Marcos regime, in comparison to, for example, the Mindanao regime, who actually want to do things except for this movement, or they also have a very, very different political leaning. But for example, Manila voters, these people are actually very appealing to different type of candidates. But secondly, I think these people are very much strong man politicians who are actually appealing to things called of personality, and they are also appealing to things sense of machismo, to the extent that insofar as you are, for example, cooperating or submitting to another type of candidate, probably that seems like you are kind of being weak. Probably you are going to be framed as, for example, you're kind of making some degree of very significant degree of cooperation or negotiation, to the extent that you also lose what you actually have. And that's why I think it is very unlikely that coalition is not going to happen. The second thing then I'm going to talk about is why the political landscape becomes disrupted. I want to talk about the incentive of the politicians when, for example, when a president is from a party, when vice president is from a different party, then there is an incentive for each of president and vice president to actually be disrupted and, for example, blame shift each other for the certain failure of policy, or significantly, deliberately, for example, trying to make sure that the other policies that they are trying to implement are something that is going to be unsuccessful, so that they can actually claim that I am into it, intentionally making certain policies incorrect, and therefore I am kind of trying to just vandalize these type of other parties' policies, so that I can also claim in political success and appeal to sense of catharsis to voters, because they already have animosity to, for example, the different type of voter bases, different type of candidates at the end of the day. The first reason is because obviously they have very much different political agenda. For example, in Mindanao, people actually have a very different political agenda. For example, in terms of religion, in terms of also things like agriculture, they actually have very different agricultural background in comparison to metropolitan Manila or what's not. And the second thing is obviously they have different political allies. For example, the Duterte is more historically close to, for example, China. In comparison to Marcos regime, the status quo, they are actually trying to put a very, very strong relationship with the U.S. or not. What this basically means is I think there is a very significant political difference, a significant political agenda and direction that they actually want to pursue. And that exactly is the reason that's why from the moment when a certain politician or a president wants to implement certain policy, for example, you want to implement this policy that actually makes us stronger tied to the U.S., then probably I think the vice president has every single incentive to make sure that this policy is not being as effective, because they don't want to have stronger ties with the U.S. They want to have other ties with other type of countries, i.e. China, and that's why I think there is an incentive for them to actively vandalize and try to blame shit for all of these their events today. The last report is that I think from the moment when the last thing as a mechanism is to show us why trust is very, very fragile and why animosity is very likely to happen. Because insofar as there are so many chronic differences at the first place, even they are about to make certain degree of cooperation with their house, that is so fragile. Because insofar as, for example, when certain type of differences happen in certain key policies, then that exactly is the moment when the voter base actually was saying that that's why I didn't want cooperation. That's why I don't really trust the other type of politician. And that exactly is the moment when, for example, the politicians who are appealing to that voter base have an active incentive to make sure that they don't really appeal to, they don't really have that much of a cooperation incentive, because they are going to see as very submitting to this particular other type of person who you are not really supposed to negotiate with. What are the impacts for this? This leads to significant political inefficiency. This looks like four things. The first thing is basic inefficient allocation of resources, because insofar as you want to implement certain policy that your other politician, president, doesn't really care about, then probably each of the resources that are allocated to each of the policies are actually going to increase. And I think this is significantly bad, especially when the Philippines is a developing country, and therefore they have a small amount of tax revenue. And therefore, I think optimizing that usage of resources is very, very important. And so for us to disperse all the resources and make inefficiency upon that, that necessarily leads to active inefficiency, active deprivation of, for example, people's opportunity to actually get better welfare policies, to actually get better foreign policies to the extent that you can actually get better trades or whatnot. But secondly, this also leads to things like less coordination between certain departments, because I think like information sharing, or things like more coordination between the direction of certain policies. For example, the agricultural policy, welfare policy, and financial policies, all these type of things are very much correlated to the extent that, for example, if you are implementing certain financial policy that is contradictory to the direction of the agriculture, then probably the efficacy of that policy significantly decreases, and this is also harmful because of the resource lacking, as I have talked about. The second thing is that I hope that these presidents are going to actively undermine the other type of like vice president decision. For example, in terms of like the South China Sea, when President Marcos wants to say that like we have to go strong against like China, well, like Duterte doesn't want to do so because they want to pursue like weaker, stronger ties with like China, then probably there actually is a very, very big animosity. The last thing is about the delay of certain decisions when you are implementing certain policies, because for example, if you're implementing some economic policies to actually deal with things in crisis situations, you are going to have significantly less ability to do so, and that actually leads to massive harm, because I feel like you actually implementing certain policy in a very important timeline is very, very important to actually make sure that people are doing safe. One of the positive mechanisms in the arts at the house. The first, obviously, is that we actually have aligned interests in the arts at the house, because you are from the basic political party, same political party, and that's why you have active incentive to actively cooperate to make sure that you are propagating your success, and you're saying that we as a government is very effective and efficient. The second thing, therefore, is also meaning that there is less amount of blame shifting, less amount of political gridlock in terms of narrative that actually happens within this particular thing. But the third thing is that I think obviously check and balance happens to some extent when there are at the house. And for example, in outside, for example, the opposing party also have the incentive to actively scrutinize what the government is actually doing. And therefore, I think a meaningful degree of check and balance also happens when there are at the house. Then, even if coalition happens, why our side is actually substantially better. The first thing is because on our side of the house, insofar as you want to make a coalition, you have to preemptively make a coalition and make the same political party before the election. What this basically means that you have to preemptively align your interests, align your policy direction, and try to make a lot of policy compromising before the election processes, before you actually propagate yourself as the same political party. And that's why I think preemptive alignment of the interests are much more likely to happen, whereas on the other side of the house, especially when different political parties are pretty much equally powerful, under your side of the house, winning each of the election is so much important. And that's why I think under their side of the house, there's significantly less incentive for you to actively cooperate with them. But secondly, under our side of the house, during the election, you have to actively justify as to why you are cooperating with the different political candidates, and try to give a lot of justification and reasons and tangible reasons as to why you now are going to be able to give a lot of good things for you, for the people in the end of the day. And that's why under our side of the house, there is much better cooperation as well.
Even if they decided at any given occasion that it wasn't a good one, they can simply just choose not to do that and get them to discharge that burden. Okay, a few things in the speech. First, this is set up. Secondly, why this choice is important for voters. And thirdly, why we can get a policy and stability as a result. Just quickly to clarify something, note that in the government, both the Vice President and the President, despite being from different parties, succeeding. Because if they simply just continue to blame things on each other, right? If they are being very disruptive and nothing ever happens, there is a chance of a third party rising up, right? Dynasties are not set in stone. Duterte disrupted the dynasty that came before him. It doesn't benefit one party more than the other to play the blame game, etc. We think they have an incentive to not be ousted from power because they weren't part of the government that entirely failed. We think they incentive to be reasonable. Moreover, no, probably in the next election they'll just be your vice president, so you probably don't want to be too much of to that. Okay. And finally, just note, I think obviously when it comes to very different policies, we see all over the world the parties with different like political leanings can moderate each other. You have to come to consensus on things. That's probably a good thing. Allocation of resources being fair and spread throughout the country, no matter what part of the country voted for who, is probably necessarily a good thing, as if we're just going to give us the president the most. Okay, on to that then. I fully agree what politics in the Philippines looks like. Something I want to note is I think the vice president has a significant level of power, and that is uniquely true on our side in order to balance the president when we have people from different parties. The president on our side is the voice that can dissent from the vice president on our side is the voice that can dissent from the president. When the vice president is simply appointed by the president in the F world, they don't have incentive to speak against the president. They don't have the incentive because they're from the same party, they probably agree. But they also just don't have the power to do so, or they'll just be fired, or they just have no one to talk about it if you're concerned about a decision or something like that. And we know that this is empirically the case. The vice president, under Duterte, criticised his pro-China policies. He was openly against the BRI. This only happens when we have split voting. You only have that sort of criticism. But moreover, note that on our side of the house, we have this president controlling by powerful ministry. They can't have it stripped from them. They have a lot of leverage to use it to negotiate so that we can have sort of decisions that are balanced, that represent a lot of the vote base. Final thing to note under that is that there are just otherwise weak constraints on power in the Philippines. They have a fairly weak judiciary, that kind of thing. That's because they're a fairly young democracy, they have a history of a lot of coups, there's a lot of corruption and power in politics. And actually the final thing to note about setup is that on our side of the house, elections necessarily become more competitive and then therefore more representative of what the people of the Philippines actually want to see in government. That's because quite often in young Asian post-colonial democracies, we might see one party just becoming the dominant party and the other becoming quite locked out of power. That's things like the LDO party in Japan, like the UMNO monopolising power in Malaysia, when as a result we see only one party seeming to have government and governing experience, because only one party has ruled for the last decade or so. On our side of the house, we remove this risk because we have the perception that this other party can be trusted because they're not being entirely locked out of government, because you're seeing the DP behaving in government, you'll see that they know what they're doing. Okay, that's the outcome. Why then do we think this choice is so important for voters? Note again, there's a pretty high burden on Africa, right? In democracies, we tend to not enjoy restricting what voters can do. We don't usually restrict voters from voting for certain parties just because we think that party might be destabilising, because it would just result in a dictatorship, right? We generally have this presumption that voters can make very good decisions. So what that means is that actors do two things they haven't done yet in this debate. Firstly, prove why it's structurally true that almost all of the time the people in the Philippines are going to make the wrong decision when it comes to voting in a coalition government or not voting in a coalition government or whatever. And secondly, that even then that means it's justified in depriving them of their right to have autonomy over what the government looks like. Note in our world, voters could elect a VP and president from the same party, but we have a significant amount of people voting for two different parties, even though they presumably prefer, it's like politically more aligned with one party, but the fact that they have voted for a vice president doesn't really suggest that they have this preference for having split government. I think voters can generally make good decisions, right? I think we have the plurality of media in the Philippines. There's generally a high level of education. There is a pretty high burden on ACT to prove that Filipinos cannot make good decisions. They cannot win this debate unless they do that. But another pathway to victory, why we also are able to achieve better policy and stability in the Philippines as a result of split voting. Okay. Context here is that a large amount of the political power in the Philippines is concentrated in the executive. They have the parliamentary system, they have the legacy of switching between periods of military occupation, and the result of this is that because there are often relatively peaceful transitions, it means that these institutions and these military occupations won't entirely collapse but carry through, so we continue to have quite centralised power in the small, executive in the Filipino government. Okay. Moreover, note that there is the first past post system, which means parties often have majorities in the National Assembly, and finally, often the public service is quite politicised, which means we don't actually have public servants able to make free and frank criticisms of the government. We have the executive with quite a significant amount of power. That's important. But additionally, note there's often quite a large amount of power within individuals in the executive. We've often seen quite a bit of corruption in the Philippines. That means we have things like public funds being siphoned out. But it also means we have something like the patronage network of sorts, where we have this cult of power of personality that everyone talked about with Marcos, with Duterte. So it becomes quite difficult to oppose people with an executive that is entirely dominated by one party, and as a result, within the entire political system, it is entirely dominated by one party, unless we have a vice president. That's the world in which ACT has to stand for. Why is the world so much better on our side of the house? The first thing to say is I think the policy we get is much better. The vice president has the ability of, no, we think that we can have like the president pushing for often quite absurd, quite problematic policies. We have the Duterte pushing for quite an absurd war on drugs. We have Duterte trying to abandon the US alliance and remove the US presence in the country before actually getting concessions from China, before actually getting like BRI money from China. It's only when we're able to have like Marcos or like a VP from another party within the executive who's able to criticise that, who's able to moderate and improve the quality of these decisions, and also making sure that these decisions are better reflecting a wider proportion of the country, and therefore just better quality decisions that reflect more people's views. The VP has firstly the capacity to do this, right? Because they have a ministry that they can leverage, so they can frustrate things there until they reach some sort of agreement. And also they just like have this ability to be free and frank with the president in a way that much of the use then on their executive otherwise aren't able to. And obviously they've been incented to make sure that these decisions that come out are good. They are seen as being vice presidents, they can quite a lot of control. They are seen as responsible for the decisions being made by the government. But obviously this is also moderated by the fact that they don't want to burn bridges that are going to be entirely unreasonable because the voting cycle is going to swing the next year and then that's going to come back to bite them. Okay. So compare that with maybe policies taking a little bit longer on our side of the house because we have to come to some sort of agreement. But ultimately, I think that these policies are far better for the people of the Philippines. They're far better thought through and they're far more representative. But moreover, we're able to achieve better stability on our side of the house. An additional benefit here, because we often do have provinces in the Philippines like Mindanao, which are plagued by separatism, religious extremism, which means that when one factor of the picture of Filipino politics becomes too powerful, we have the risk of coups. We don't have this, this is far less likely to happen on our side of the house when the vice president has a clear incentive to be able to stay in government, do not have a coup, like overthrow the government. On our side of the house, we have better policy, we have better stability, and most importantly, we give the opportunity for the people of the Philippines to make decisions about their lives.
I have 5 responses, and then I'm going to talk about why we get better policy on our side of the house. The first thing I want to do is to frame out this idea that a third party might rise and therefore they have an incentive to make sure they do well. There are 2 reasons why this oftentimes doesn't happen. The first reason is that because the 2 biggest parties have very strong elite backings, which means they can do a couple of things. The first thing that they currently do is doing things like heavily funding things like troll farms, which means that a lot of the people on the ground oftentimes don't get accurate information. They aren't exposed to things like third parties, which is why you don't see a third party rising in the past, like many years in the past. The second reason is that oftentimes the Philippines also has many shady electoral practices things like vote buying, which oftentimes it is just very unlikely for a third party to happen just by virtue of the fact that you have like shady election politics as opposed to things as well as things like misinformation. So this is unlikely. This is not in the debate on either side of the House. The second thing they can come up and say is that there is a choice that is important. The first thing is that on our side of the House, the choice also exists. Insofar as all of the parties still exist, people can still vote for the party that they want to vote for. I think the second thing is, if we're able to prove that this choice doesn't lead to the things that people actually want, then it is not something that's beneficial. Because their principle of choice is that you should have a choice to vote for both president and vice president, so that you can come to some reasonable moderation. So it is a result contingent principle, which means that if we're able to prove why the results are worse than if you weren't given this choice, I think that it is okay for us to take away the choice to vote separately for the president and the vice president. And here's where the problem of the other side lies, right? Because they can see that these people have some level of animosity, but they don't explain why this animosity reasonably leads to good policies. What we've predominantly explained to you is why this animosity is more likely to lead to bad policies. So they need to win the characterization battle as to why it is more likely that they make good policies if these are people that actively hate each other, if these are people that have different elite backings, if these are people that are predominantly different voter bases. So it is unclear why, as opposed to the animosity leading to good outcomes. So that is what the next speaker has to prove for them to win this debate. The last thing I want to talk about is criticism, because they say that you can only criticize each other if you're within that government. I think that is untrue, but I'm also going to flip this argument. First, this is untrue because even if you're not within that government, you can still criticize, which means that if Duterte is in power, even if Marcos is not under the Duterte as the vice president, you can still criticize Duterte, even if you're outside that party. The second thing is that oftentimes there are other checks and balances that are reasonably possible, things like parliament. So if they want to claim that things like checks and balances are reasonable, I think that parliament still exists on our side of the house to make sure that these things are properly checked and balanced. But the second flip to this is, I think that criticism happens better if you are outside the government, because if it is true that both of you are inside the government, you cannot criticize each other, or your parties cannot criticize the government, because you are also a part of that government, which means that insofar as that is true, I think that criticism happens far better if you're outside the government in the first place. So I think that if criticism is an important value, we think we get that better on our side of the house. The last thing I want to respond to is this idea that in the end, one party will dominate. This is obviously untrue. The reason why we constantly have different parties coming, one being the president and one being the vice president, is precisely because you have two strong parties in the Philippines, which means that it is very unlikely you will have one party dominate the entire politics, insofar as you have a separate voter base, you have separate elite groups that are constantly and consistently backing these different parties. So it is unclear why one party will dominate, and that's what will happen to the Philippines. The first thing I want to talk about then is why we create inefficient governments on their side of the house. And here I want to explain why people are more likely to prioritize blocking each other and sabotaging each other as opposed to making good policy, and this is the likelihood analysis that will win the deadlock in the first speakers. I think there are 4 reasons for this. The first is because there is a different group of elites that are funding your campaign to begin with. But the second is that oftentimes a lot of them depend on things like strongman politics and a couple of personality. The reason why a lot of people vote for people like Marcos is because they remember the good old times of Marcos, or that's created by the fake news that they see on media. It's largely because he showed a strongman attitude to things like foreign policy, which is why it's political suicide for a lot of these candidates to make compromises, which is why it is more important for them to make sure that they are sticking to their principles, to appear as if they are sticking to their values, as opposed to making good policy, because it is more important to their voter base to make sure that these people are sticking to their principles, as opposed to shifting between different parties, which means that it is more important for these people to make sure that they don't make compromises, but continue their strong attitude comparatively. The reason why this is more important is because it's more existential in nature, which means that on our side of the house, even if you don't make good policy, you can still get elected, you can still get funding for your campaigns, insofar as the same group of elites like you, insofar as you can still say the reason why we didn't get good policy is because they kept blocking it, which means that it is possible for you to do things like blame shifting on their side of the house, say that I tried to do this, but then they weren't doing, they didn't let me do it for example, which means that it is unlikely that this person gets the blame. You oftentimes blame shift to the other group. And the reason why this is also possible is because a lot of these parties have things like a lot of media and a lot of money they can spend into things like funding campaigns and like funding the public narrative about why these governments are not doing well, which oftentimes means that there is a large capacity for a lot of these candidates to blame shift to the other side, as opposed to having to take all the blame them in the first place. But the reason why we said this was bad is 3 reasons. First is because oftentimes, like the budget used is oftentimes split between the president and the vice president, which means like a lot of the government funding will now be used for different things, which means that the government cannot prioritize a particular thing that they want to. The second thing is oftentimes what that means is a lot of the vice presidents have very strong powers. You can have vetoes, you can have executive powers, you can vote in parliament, so on and so forth. But the third thing is that these vice presidents are oftentimes heads of agencies, which means you can harm things like interagency cooperation, which means that if all of the other agencies have particular the president's goal in mind, but then this particular agency is run by the vice president and therefore prioritizes what the vice president wants, it means that you can harm interagency cooperation. Insofar as, for example, interagency cooperation is very important for things like sharing information, doing things like coordinating economic and agricultural policy, so on and so forth. But the next thing I want to talk about is, if there is an incentive for different parties to cooperate, like what happened in the most recent election, so Marcos and Duterte cooperated, why is it better on our side? Because I think the change here is quite simple. They cooperate before the elections as opposed to after the elections are over. Why is this better? First, it's because it happens at an earlier point in time, which means there is more time you can allot to things like policy and government once you're in office. Why does this oftentimes take a lot of time? Because decisions such as compromises take time, which means because you have to think through each of the compromises strategically to make sure that it doesn't anger your voter base, for example. Or do things like you have to meet your advisors and talk through a lot of the compromising political decisions you want to make. The second is that during that time, you obviously cannot push forward any political decisions because you have not reached a consensus. Which means that on our side of the house, if it is true that parties have an incentive to cooperate, we do that far better because it happens before the elections, and therefore all of the time during the term can be used for actually enacting these policies in the first place. But But the second thing is predictability. I think that here, what it means is voters know what exactly they're voting for before the elections as opposed to after the elections. Because the fact of the matter is, negotiation, compromising happens on their side of the house at a later point in time behind closed doors, which means you make it much less predictable. There are 2 impacts. First, the principal impact, because it's principally unjust that people don't know what they're going to get when they vote for it, which means on their side of the house, you have a large section of unpredictability, which means that people do not know what exactly the compromises that will be made after the voting happens, because you don't know whether or not it will be a split government or not a split government before the voting is actually done. Second part is that it harms the ability to get things like FDI, because foreign policy is very unclear, because you don't know which president, which vice president will get elected, you don't know what economic policies that will happen, which means that you get far less investment on their side of the house as well. If coalitions don't happen, we win. If it does happen, it gets far better on our side. For all these reasons,
F says the vice president can't actually criticize the president because they're in the same government. Note that in this one sentence, F contradicts all of their material, inefficiency, and animosity. 3 things I'm going to do in today's speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about choice. Secondly, does a coalition happen and what does that look like? And then I'm going to deal with F's comparative. Okay, firstly, on choice. F tells you briefly that it's only important so far as people actually get the outcome they want, and because they think they're getting moderation, then this doesn't happen, right? Note, under our side, you can see that what you wanted was not effective. You can see that what you you voted for was not implemented, and if this is the case, you simply just change your vote the next election, and then you get somebody else voted in, right? We think this actually is choice because you're able to actually exercise it. Note the comparative under their side is that if it's not effective, you don't get that change in the next election, right? This is choice, even if virus is delayed a few years. We think that's really, really important and not a sufficient response. I think that deals with that sufficiently. Then more importantly, because it's been everybody's spending their time, what does this coalition actually look like? A lot of material to cover here. But the first thing to preface this point with is to say that this is actually the status quo, right? Because Abby spent so long in her speech explaining exactly how this is the case, because we wouldn't have these coalition governments for the majority of the last 20 years if this wasn't effective and this wasn't indicative of what people actually wanted. So no, based on context alone, you already have to buy what we're telling you. But what was their pushbacks? Firstly, they tell you there's an incentive to be really disruptive. Firstly, I think it's not, because I think that you want to come back, you want your party to come back because you want the power, because you want the money, because you want to make it to the end of the term, because you want to be held in good regard by the Philippines. Right? But secondly though, I think that the Philippines has a really strong history of coups, and I don't think that that's something political leaders want. Secondly, they tell you that there's different agendas and therefore there's bad resource allocation, right? I think that this is actually really, really good, because the comparative is that you simply just prioritize your own voter base, which is really bad, and I don't think that's democratic. Why? Because the entirety of the voter base is diverse, so when you're allocating resources in a diverse way, I think that's really good. Because the farmers might want tons of resource allocation towards agriculture, but like city folk might want on transport, right? I think this is really good because everybody's looked after, because it's far better than having a high concentration or like only slight marginal, economies of scale in a certain place. Why is this really important though, not just in like a debate sense, but particularly in the context we're actually talking about? I think it's because the Philippines landscape has had historically one group dominate, and that's really, really bad. And I think that even if you don't care about the democratic principle of equality, and when you don't think it's just a generally good thing when everybody gets a little bit of the cake, I think you just care about political stability. Because I think that the political systems are far more stable when everybody's happy, when everybody's looked after. I think that's a really good benefit. So perhaps you get far more resource allocation. Great, heavily winning on that. Secondly, they tell you you don't want stronger ties with the USA. Look, I think it's really good to have moderating influences therefore to stop individuals from making irrational decisions such as they have in the past, right? Because it means that if someone's going to make a stupid decision that is going to screw over your country, then you have someone else being like, whoa, yo, let's not do that. I think that's really beneficial. The next push we heard was about animosity, that you didn't want that, right? Saying, I didn't want that, that wasn't my decision. I think that if you're saying that you weren't accountable for a decision that your government made, you actually come across as incredibly weak, right? Because if you can't even negotiate with your vice president, how can your country expect you to negotiate with China or the USA or foreign powers? I don't think that you get re-elected. I don't think you have any incentive to say that at all, right? But look, we think that criticism is actually really, really powerful on the outside of the house and very, very possible, right? Because it means you're actually now sitting in these cabinet meetings. This means that you've got far more leverage because you're in those meetings. You actually have far more information. You actually know what's going on behind those doors, right? You are far better able to criticize on the outside. That's really powerful. You get accountability. You get change. That's really beneficial. Okay. The next question they told you is about different elites funding the different elite groups fund these parties, right? Three responses to this. The first is to say, if this is true, this is incredibly dangerous if these elites are able to do so in a way that is uncontrolled and unmoderated, right? Which means if you believe all of their materials, all this extreme power and all these terrible incentives that these elite parties have, then that must be really, really, really bad if they have the ability to carry that out without anybody stopping it. If you believe that's true, then you have to side with us because we're the only side that stops them from being able to do so. But the second pushback, the second response to this, is to say that we actually think elites want stable governance, right? Because these people are commercial leaders in their countries, because they rely on having a stable economy with stable jobs, with stable governance, with stable legal systems. We think that this is really important to them to have stability. Thirdly though, we think that if it's so true that elites have so much power, then why does the voter base even matter, right? We think that wouldn't be the conversation we're having in this debate. So what were the outcomes then of their point? We think, they told you about there's going to be inefficiency because there's less coordination between the departments, right? I think this is actually in tension with their case. Because if it's true, then you do get agriculture doing exactly what they want. You do get those quick financial reactions to crises, right? So it necessarily washes out a significant amount of their benefits if you think there's no coordination, because then you do get those benefits of efficiency. So they actually have to pick one and be able to choose it to matter. So what's the comparative that we actually tell you that we get under our side of the house? We get far better policy, we get negotiations, we get moderations, right? Even so far as we lose a little bit of time, we think that's still really an important trade-off to make at the point in time of stopping elites from corrupting your country or making terrible decisions for people who don't deserve it. Okay. Yes, right. We think that this is particularly important given the context that Abby's giving you. Note that it hasn't been contested in this debate, so you have to necessarily believe that it's so important. Okay, moving on into the final pushback, the comparative, that cooperating before is better, and then secondly on unpredictability. So cooperating earlier is better, but two responses to this. The first is to say that literally provided you with no incentive as to why you would do it earlier. I say secondly, I think that it's going to be, I think if a party thinks that they're going to win, then you would simply just give it to your own party. So it's really unclear as to why you have these conversations earlier, because if you're so confident you wouldn't be having these negotiations, that doesn't really make sense, right? I think the comparative that actually happens is that you probably under outside would just have some sort of caretaker government that holds parliament until the next until you have an established government. I think it's perfectly adequate, and notice the status quo in many countries. But secondly, then the other push was on unpredictability. Two responses. The first, I think, it's actually not unpredictable because you probably just know there's going to be a decent compromise. And even so far as you're not sure exactly what that looks like, you know that it's probably going to be within the middle of two different agreements, right? You know that it's going to be some sort of compromise. We think this is far better than not knowing exactly what a party that you didn't vote for that's run by corrupt elites is going to do. I'd rather pick that any day. But the second response is that you probably just get far more stable foreign policy because you've got, I think at the end of this debate, it's really important to note that having coalition governments is intuitively just the status quo and true of many functioning countries, of many countries with high democracies, right? Note that none of them are corrupt, that they're all doing pretty well. I think this is really important, and we probably just have this significant advantage of the status quo to help us in this debate, and could really proud to stand.
Yeah, it's fine.
Speech will begin in 3, 2, 1. So first I want to take down this idea of voters' choice, right? The first response is we don't make a VP election after choosing the president, meaning that if you don't know who the president is going to be, it's not necessarily the case in the vast majority of cases that you're voting for that VP because you want to split government, but rather because you like that VP candidate more. So I think in many cases, because people cannot be ensured that all people will vote just like you, they in vast majority of cases just vote for the same parties, or even in cases they don't, they will just vote on the relative popularity or relative favorability of these candidates. They don't prove to you why this choice is actually a choice to make a split government. But second, even if you don't buy this rebuttal, always in democracies, there's a trade-off between representation and effective governments. That is why, for instance, they do not promote for voting for every single administration positions within the government. Or for instance, the reason why we don't vote for every single policies in referendums, but just vote for a candidate, even if it might not effectively represent my preferences in every single policy agendas. That's why if we prove that this policy significantly hampers with the efficient governance of this government, I think we are able to outweigh the marginal degree of representation because they don't prove to why a representation in split government is necessarily absolutely more valuable than just voting for the same ticket on our side of the house. So I think this is contingent on practical. Then I'm going to first talk about what this split government looks like. Does it lead to more checks and balances as they want, or does it lead to more inefficient government functioning? And note that things like these people having more information and more leverage is value neutral at this point, because they can exercise this power in a good way, but also in a bad way. Therefore, the likelihood analysis of using this power is important. They say checks and balances occur, but first assumption of this argument is that checks and balances are impossible otherwise, because one party is dominating in Philippines politics and there is no parliamentary discussion. We just outright deny the characterization. The info slide says that for many governments, there were split governments, indicating that there are different parties that people vote for. Also, I point to things like Yellow Revolution within the Philippines, where people did oust the government in many cases. Also, the idea of their argumentation that people want different split governments shows that people do preference many parties on that side of the house. Then secondly, they don't prove why this checks and balances that has to happen within that administration. The only one piece of mechanism we get is, oh, these people have more information. But in many cases, the most important decisions that government hold is open to the public because they have to make decisions and they're bound by the law and constitution to get approval from things like Congress. Therefore, I'm not sure if this additional information is so critical to promoting these checks and balances. And that is why, but thirdly, even if all their characterization is true, then if their characterization that, for instance, you don't want the third party rising and therefore you don't want to critique the government to the maximum extent, then presumably, and even in the case scenario, we don't think that this criticizing will be as effective and as maximalist as they want to promote on that side of the bench. So that was an even if rebuttal on our side. But second, why do we think that it's actually more likely that this leads to inefficient governance? Things like VPs actively challenging the president, making the government inefficient. Like they say, like this isn't likely because you don't want the third party to rise on that side of the bench. Firstly, we point you to the fact that this is just empirically untrue. Historically, what has happened in the Philippines, for instance, we've seen presidents just put vice presidents in relatively unimportant departments like the education ministry, and because the vice president thinks that person is not reflected within this administration, they've radicalized in many cases to abuse the powers that are given as VP. For instance, using parliamentary voting power, or for instance, using the power of budget that's given to VP, or for instance, using insider information and leaking it to other media sources, and to actually radicalize against this lack of power given within the current status quo. But secondly, we've told you other alternative ways in which these presidents can avoid criticism of inefficient governments. And the best way to do this is to say, just do blame shifting, right? That the reason why this government is inefficient right now is because the VP is bothering, and the VP can have the same rhetoric, right? So insofar as they can shield themselves from the criticisms of inefficient governments, all the positive incentives that negative gives isn't likely to be the critical tipping point of promoting good and healthy discussion. We've given you a lot of mechanisms on this. We've told you there has been a history of animosity between different dynasties. We've also told you that most of these leaders rely on strongman politics of not backing down but standing confident and strong against external forces. And because of things like coups, because of things like external influences like China and the Philippines, that is why the narrative that's dominant in politics isn't negotiation and compromise. It's more staying strong against opposition, and that's what's likely to manifest within this government as well. But thirdly, notice that their mechanism of, oh, these people want stable governments is very fragile and rely on the goodwill of individuals or goodwill of these individuals. We think that this is necessarily fragile because if there's one key issue in which these individuals disagree upon, and therefore there's massive blame shifting in this, then it leads to massive distrust between the actors. So there's game theory right here, because now if you want to cooperate and the other side doesn't, you look extremely stupid and you can't gain political leverage out of blame shifting or spinning the narrative off of this. And why is this first instance for key disagreements likely to happen? You can just look at the first negative speech, right? Because what they wanted was for the VP to challenge on significant issues like Philippines' US policies, and disagreements are bound to happen. And if that's the case, it's likely to roll back into instability. But fourthly, like they say, like these people want stable governments, but presumably if you're the VP, you want to be president one day, so you want to challenge the status quo. So I don't think that it's the case that these people are status quo biased in the current status quo. Then let's do some weighing, because we think that even if checks and balances is important, we think that it's better that it happens outside of the government. Firstly, because the executive is not a branch of moderating different values, because you have Congress for that, and the Congress gives you laws to bind governments, and the government treaties and the important ones get approval from Congress. So the representation of values can happen via checks and balance mechanisms existing in modern democracies. But second, what happens on that side is the actual operation of these governments become inefficient. And I argue that this is important for people on the ground. So even if the policies that we implement are not perfectly representative of the entire demographic, at least people get that. Which means that, for instance, people are delayed of getting social services on their side because of delayed governmental decisions. This is especially important, for instance, in times of crisis, like COVID-19, where people needed to get welfare right now. But moreover, we tell you coordination is also important, because things like your welfare policies have to be necessarily coordinated with how your food prices are controlled, and therefore things like agricultural policies. And therefore this effective governance or effective use of the government budget is unlikely to happen on that side. But lastly, we argue that diplomatic consistency is also important, because if the president pushes for a certain agenda and the VP just criticizes the president outright, then that government looks extremely weak against external forces and looks as if it can be easily manipulated. Therefore, we think that this inconsistency within the government is also extremely important. So we outweigh any kind of checks and balances that they argue for. But moving on to the second clash, in the best case scenario where checks and balances are possible, which means that there isn't a huge level of animosity and there's incentive of different actors to work together, we think that then, if that's the context, what's a reasonable model on our side would be a reasonable coalition that will be happening on our side as well. Therefore, in your best case, we have to win on our argumentation. We told you on our side, when coalitions happen, you have to tone down animosity between different parties because you have to justify being on the same ticket. But moreover, you have to make campaign policy promises early on in the election stage, which means that it's more transparent and there's actual time in the government to do actual governance on our side of the bench when you get elected. We heard absolutely no engagement against this material, whereas this is the actual engagement that deals with the context in which the negative was only willing to debate upon. I think the new rebuttal at third negative is extremely unfair, therefore we already took the debate on it. Very positive.
If it is the case that new responses at third neg are too new to be credited, I might as well go them now. But I'm already here, so I'm going to give some responses anyway. Three things in the speech. First, I'm going to talk about the burdens of the state and how the way they've set up their case implies an incredibly high burden for a third. Second, I'm going to talk about how we uniquely improve the functioning of government and why we get better and more relevance to policy. So firstly, let's talk about the burdens here. This occurs in two ways. Firstly, there is a principal burden that we set up around how it's really important that we should trust the voters to make good decisions in democracy. Like, I think Peter Dutton's a wanker, but that's not a reason to strip away voting rights from in Queensland, right? I think even if you think that there are possibly significant practical benefits, know that this is a very high burden for me because you can't take away, even if they say that there are some cases you make a trade-off, you'll make a trade-off if you think there is a 51-49% chance of your outcome. For them to overcome this principle, they need to prove it with a very high level of certainty their practical case. But there also is this second layer of the practical burden in terms of the revealed preferences that form. If everything they tell you is true, why is it the case that in almost every election in the past 55 years, the Filipino public chose to have a split ticket in executive if it was so catastrophically bad at any election and in any election in the future, they could vote to change that. Let's think about what needs to happen for this to be the case, right? Because clearly any given voter prefers one party over the other. The fact that we consistently have split executives shows that a very large portion of the electorate makes the decision to take a different party for the vice president because they prefer split ticket voting. The response we hear from third is that this happens before the election, so this isn't reflective of any sort of preference. Firstly, I still think it probably reveals a preference. If you're not certain who the person is, voting for two different parties implies you want two different parties to be in power. Secondly, realistically, in most elections, election polls exist. There's often expectations about the next election. Like, no one's really doubting who's going to be the next prime minister of the UK, right? Most elections, people can see the writing on the wall. So I don't think that that's a particularly good response either. And thirdly, even at their worst, they tell you that, oh, the real reason people vote for different vice presidents is because they just personally prefer one vice president to the other. If that is the case, I also think that it's fine. If they prefer one vice president to the other, that's probably the vice president they should have. So I think at the end, the only other thing to note is that they tell you that these things will happen. There is cooperation before the election and coalitions form under animosity. There are two things here. Firstly, clearly there is no incentive for this to happen because uniquely on our side, the incentive for the Marcos and Duterte regimes to cooperate to form a second party ticket was to avoid only because there was a risk that the president or the vice president would be from different parties you want to create that. When you know that there is no split ticket voting, there's no incentive to do this, you just appoint a president who's not a vice president who's not going to criticize you. Even if that were the case where, again, if it is true what they say, however, that is catastrophically bad for democracy because that means there is no competition whatsoever. Under our side, the presidency and the vice presidency are both contested and they just happen to go to different parties. Under their side, when there was an agreement before the election, there was no choice because neither the presidency or the vice presidency is contested by a major political faction. So it's actually catastrophic for their case if that is true. So let's look at how we can improve the functioning of the government here. What did they tell you? They told you that there is a blame game and it's going to bring down the government. Firstly, I don't think there is an incentive for either party to use to bring down the government to the point where it is just catastrophic. Obviously, they dissent to some extent, that's the point of our case. But they dissent where and where it is the most valuable, the most important. Because there are three reasons why you don't want to form. Note that this applies in the context of a repeated prisoner's dilemma, right? If you're very belligerent, the other party will also start being belligerent, and both sides get taken down. It's not clear who benefits more from a situation in which there is constant blame shifting and the government collapses. Why are they at risk of this? Firstly, third parties. They tell you that third parties won't form because of these the propaganda If it was that powerful, if there was such powerful like election interference, like one party would be in trouble all the time. The fact that there was still change in power play that to some extent in extreme cases the parties plausibly could form. Even if you don't believe that, these two other layers that we're never respond to. Firstly, people within parties can become disempowered. If you're the vice president of a party and your party and you tear down the government and everything goes to shit and everyone hates that party now, you're probably not going to be the presidential candidate in the next cycle if you're just clearly competent and clearly able to do the work of governing. You as an individual lose power within that party. But thirdly, even if that doesn't happen, just a government which collapses in infighting is just unable to pass the policy preferences of either party, and you would rather get half of your policies across than none. Secondly, they tell you that there is a unique level of incentive that comes from different elite backing. I think that this is actually going to flip this. The fact that parties have elite backing means they are much more likely to cooperate. The interest of elites, which are primarily commercial elites, so very powerful business people, for example, is that they want stable government. If you're running a multinational business in the Philippines, you don't want a government that is constantly blame shifting, unable to pass any policies, unable to set up an effective regulatory system that allows your business to thrive. What you want is consensus and you want stability. So if you're assigned a belligerent, elites are going to push the parties they back to cooperate. Elites would rather have half of their policies passed than none of their policies passed. So elites, if anything, improve the prospects of cooperation. Thirdly, they tell you that there are strongman incentive. There is strongman. There's an incentive for these to look like strongmen. You don't look strong if you're having a hissy fit because your vice president said something mean to you at a cabinet meeting. You look strong if you're able to write a united front and pass the policies you get. It's unfair for strongmen to necessarily manifest and you just being belligerent to the point where you get nothing done because then you're not very strong because you're clearly not strong if you can't do anything in government. Sorry, this don't check off. So lastly then, what did we tell you? Firstly, we told you that uniquely it was improved because there are now checks on power and accountability. Nothing unique. They tell you that there are other things like the National Assembly. Note that the first-class system of the Philippines often means that the party that controls the presidency also has a majority in the National Assembly, or at least is part of as with ideologically and parties. Even if this is only true in some of the cases, that means in a lot of the cases, the president does not receive accountability from the National Assembly because their party's in control and their party's not going to go up against our president. Uniquely, we almost guarantee that there is some opposition power that has structural influence within the Philippine government. Even if it is true that there are sometimes, at best, this response is only mitigatory. Even if there is some level of accountability on our side, we get much more accountability on our side, and that's a unique benefit. All they can ever do is mitigate this. There are a lot of reasons that we never respond about why that's particularly important. The only other thing I tell you here is that there is an inefficient use of resources because they distribute inefficient resources. But not the other framing that these parties are tied to specific geographic and demographic bases. So the Marcos is tied to the cities and Duterte side to the rural south. If that is true, I think it is much better that there are reasons to disperse resources equally. Because if you buy the framing and the mechanism, the logical conclusion is that when Duterte is in power, all of the money goes to the Mindanao in the south. When Marcos is in power, all of the money goes to their voter base in the cities. I think it is much better when there are regions that they have to split it both ways. So I think that there's an active harmony case what they tell you. Lastly, why the moderation is good. The process what we get is that we get a level of consensus for policies to pass because of the power show that exists within cabinet. The VP has all the leverage that Abby tells you about that isn't really contested. I think importantly, this also gets a lot of the things that they tell you are good because they make a big point about the stability of policy and they specifically tie the foreign direct investment to one stable foreign policy. All of the context about strong mean politics in your he tells you why uniquely in the case that they don't get stability of policy. Empirically, Duterte had wild foreign policy ideas about abandoning the US alliance for almost nothing, and that was only rolled back when there was a large-scale cabinet revolt led by his vice president to roll back the policy and reinstate the US alliance. This is we're the only side that can say moderating influence that moderates out the extremes of foreign policy, which means we block all of their benefits. The reason why this is structurally the reason why this is structurally likely because that the NYU is unique to our side, because on their side, even if opposition leaders can criticize the change in policy, on our side, the opposition leader also controls the ministry, also has a lot more information about the cabinet, sees the cabinet papers, sees the national intelligence report, has a much greater capacity to challenge and moderate our government, and that's why we uniquely get more stable and more well-thought policies on our side. Even if you're uncertain about the outcome of the debate, we win because of the real risk, because of the burdens that they see from the government.
one choice, I think there's a pretty high threshold for ACT to prove that we don't trust the people of the nation to make these decisions about themselves. Even if it is entirely true that often when people vote for a different president and vice president, they are just doing so because they happen to like a candidate more, and also maybe they actually don't really know how the election will pan out, then even if the stand is obviously still true that these people can at least contemplate that voting for a different president and a different vice president might result in a different president and a different vice president getting into government. Maybe because they've seen it happen for decades, time and time again. I think as people are able to see this as a possible outcome of their vote, they're able to make a trade-off, and therefore they have a revealed preference for being able to make that choice about themselves. Obviously, we are not seeing the catastrophic inefficiencies, deadlocks, injustices that Africa wanted to talk about. I think the people of the Philippines can make this decision. Why is this important? Firstly, it's obviously just important that we kind of like give these people a like the opportunity to decide who represents them, insofar as they want people, they've shown that they want that decision. Most people aren't interested in voting for the sheriff, and that's fine that we don't give them the account, that's fine that we don't give them the opportunity, but the people of the Philippines have shown that they're interested in having that decision. And the second thing is just that obviously it has just like huge practical implications for the rest of this debate, which means that this debate does actually fall on this clash. Because even though there are a lot of smart people in this debate that seem to know a lot about Filipino politics, they probably don't know more about Filipino politics than people of the Philippines and what they actually want. You have to give this debate on this clash. If you don't, let's then talk about moderation in policy and why that's so important. A few things to say here. The first is that obviously when we get policy that is more of a compromise that represents more people and the interests of more people in the country, right? And so far as we have decent standards of welfare, we're saying multiple different stakeholders instead of just like vast inequalities across a number of different groups. The second thing is moderation in policy or compromise is so important is because we have less likelihood of a coup. This has gone vastly unresponded to in this debate. We told you that when one faction becomes too powerful, the political context is there for a coup to be quite likely. This is important because it results in immense human suffering when people rise up and cause like significant violence. It means it literally collapses democracy for the period of time in which this coup exists, therefore just like collapsing all the benefits we were trying to concern ourselves with before. And the final thing to say is, if AFRA's inefficiency so much, a coup is pretty inefficient, guys. Because maybe on our side of the house, it takes a month to reach an agreement because they have, like, the two parties, like, have a lot of pride, you know, so they're trying to like be critical to each other. When you have a coup, it takes years to recover, and you never get policy in that addresses things like COVID. Though note, obviously, most decisions do not have to be made in a very small amount of time, things like COVID, and even then, it's probably not an inherently bad trade-off. The decisions about things like COVID probably are quite well thought through. I just don't think it was an intuitive way for ACT on that point anyway. Okay, so coups are pretty bad. What else is important when it comes to moderation, and why is that very important for policy? We gave you context in this debate that when one party, or essentially in this context, one person can make all of the decisions about a country, they make pretty bad ones. They like enough money, they push extreme agendas. We told you about corruption and power being concentrated in individuals. That's the reason why we told you about the judiciary, yes men being appointed in your executive, parliament not having a whole lot of influence. This material is really important because 3F is entirely right to say that we do have to make a trade-off between good representative policies and efficiency in governance. That's true, it's often hard to know where that line is, but this material shows that electing the vice president is a crucial tipping point because of the enormous amount of power that has existed in a very small amount of people if we do not have a vice president from another party, or if at least we don't give the people of the Philippines the opportunity to decide that that's something they care about. Very proud to say.
The first thing to talk about is the likelihood battle. Is cooperation and moderation more likely, or political grid more likely? The first to observe is that there are like negative case upon our side is that like people are only going to take care about things in corruption, and that's why like better policies are not going to happen. But if you actually listen to their positive case about things like why politicians want stable government, why politicians want to be re-elected, and therefore they are going to implement good policies. Also, these type of incentives symmetrically apply to our side of the house. If they really want to believe that politicians really care about re-election, but we really care about stability, then even under our side of the house, probably that incentive also symmetrically applies under our side of the house. This is very unclear why they actually care about things like bullying, things like corruption, well, but on top of that, we also told you as to why even under our side of the house, we have a bunch of check and balance mechanisms as well, even if corruption and stuff like that exists, things like parliamentary check and balance, or even outside, all those type of like, for example, when Duterte is a president, probably Marcos have every single incentive to actively scrutinize Duterte to make sure that he gets elected in the next election. But the second thing that they also want to say, under our side of the house, is that, well, if you want to be re-elected, at least want to be stable or whatnot. I think they're the permitted to explain two things. The first thing is that we told you that these are core issues that are very, very hard to be negotiated at the first place. It is your core part of your political identity. It is your core part of your voter base. And that's why cooperation itself is unlikely, because the very basis of your political identity and career is now have to be forego under their side of the house. And that's why their third negative last hill already was that, like, oh, strong man can still maintain your strong man identity by passing certain policy. Also doesn't make sense, because from the moment when you have used your political dynasty for like 100 years for supporting Mindanao, but at the same time you also agree upon a policy that supports Luzon, I'm really unsure as to why you're going to agree upon that. But the second thing is, we also told you as to why you are going to satisfy with the current position, because one should be in the vice president, one should be in president, then that, like, obviously, constantly you are under a certain political opponent if you are a vice president. And that's why there's an incentive for regime change, because you want to be the next president, not the vice president like forever. Why are you going to be very satisfied with that particular current position? That was exactly our third affirmative material. That was never responded by third negative. And then they want to rehash this idea that, oh, like new party, new politician. I think we also explained to you as to why this is very, very like, because of things like fake news, because of things like misinformation, due to massive discrepancy into the political like capital. I think this is empirically so much true when Lenny Robredo will have a very good potential of actually being elected, but she actually never gets elected because of all the fake news and all those like bad campaigns coming from these Marcos regime. The last thing that they say is that, oh, like the system maintained for so long time and people didn't really like it, probably you would have changed that. But I'm really kind of like unsure. But the very fact that we also have like fiat to implement this policy probably means that we also have some degree of discontent. If people are so much satisfied with this particular policy, like system in the status quo, probably this motion wouldn't have actually existed in the first place. So it's a very, very unfair policy, because they never give any structural reason as to why the people in the current state are actually in fact satisfied with the current situation. But the last thing I also want to know is the moderation of policy, if that actually is a good thing, because on a pure basis of analytical impacting, I'm really still unsure what their policy of moderation actually looks like and why that actually is ultimately good. Their best case scenario in the last hill hearing is that, oh, like you at least disperse money in both Mindanao and Luzon. At least that is better than concentrating a lot of resources in one. The first thing we also told you is that there aren't like a Congress budget allocation in order to pass that particular bill, or why you are going to like just completely abandon other type of things, why that is so politically strategic. They never explained that. But the second thing is, dispersion of the money itself is not an a priori benefit, because we told you so many things, like why it harms the coordination between things, why it actually delays the implementation of that policy to the extent that people cannot really get the money when they actually need it. So even if you have dispersed money under their house, that doesn't necessarily materialize in a way that actually helps people on the ground, which means that even if they are able to prove that dispersion, they never actually prove the actual benefit under their side. That's why I think under their side of house, they cannot win on that basis as well.
Thank you everyone for the debate. That was I thought a really high quality, really close, really engaging debate. So I think we should be very, very happy with how they went in that round. I think also the knowledge about the Philippines, I think, was both useful and for the most part pretty well deployed in the debate as well. Like it wasn't just saying things for the sake of saying them. They had relevancy arguments, and that was really good to see as well. Couple of general feedback on this debate though. The first big one I think is on the general knowledge stuff. This is, as teams point out at various points, like the status quo in the Philippines and has been for decades. I think that would be helpful both teams to have examples of where they think the policies have been disruptive or not disruptive. I think more of that, obviously it's a bit hard because of decades of Filipino history for one round of Australs, but something I think a bit more there to add a bit more ground into when this has been used and why it's been used most effectively, I think would have helped us add a bit of touching grasp to both teams. I think the second thing is there's still a bit of, I think, lack of clarity in this debate about exactly what powers the President and VP have and what they can actually do or not do vis-a-vis like passing policy. There are claims in the debate, I think, become a bit more talked about in the OA about how much relative power the executive is likely to have versus the parliament or the Congress. I think a bit clearer from both things about exactly what I think the VP has the power to do, how they use that power, and what that ends up looking like. I think not just in a sense of like, because there is some discussion of VPs have the power to like criticize or call out, etc., or be in cabinet meetings, but a bit more on like, because all this debate is about they will or won't fund the respective region that they're from. How can they do that? What are they actually doing? I think would have helped elevate the debate a little bit. I think that's the main stuff for the feedback. In terms of the result then, it was a split decision and the panel had one trainee, one panel and one chair. And so I had a different call for both the trainee and the panel, but as only two casting votes, my vote's one that stands. And ultimately I awarded the debate to side negative on a close margin. Congratulations. Commiserations side AF, I said very, very high quality debate, reflective I think in a very reasonable split in today's debate. I will give the OA, I guess, from the majority perspective, but I will try where I can to add in where the panel had the biggest points of difference, but I would advise you guys to speak to all members of the panel afterwards to get the full spread of the reasoning. So, in terms of the decision then, I think there are three issues in the debate. The first one I want to talk about is this principle of voting and democracy and choice. I think this is the biggest push we get from side negative, that people have a right to vote, more democracy is good, more choice is good, and they're likely to make it well. So they point to a bit of revealed preference history stuff, like people have for decades voted for this idea of a split system, and therefore they're likely to support it. We all respect the rights of the Filipino groups to make that choice. I think this is probably I think it is one of Neg's biggest pushes. I'm not sure it is their most successful or their strongest ultimate push in the debate. I think AF does enough to make it very small in the debate. First response we hear is like, they still get choice, still exists under your side. You still vote for like a presidential ticket, you still vote for the parliament, etc. So it's a marginal less choice, but do we care about much about that margin? But secondly, that it's outcome dependent. I think on the outcome dependent, I'm not entirely sure that this principle is outcome dependent given from AF. I think from Neg. I think at times the principle is largely that we should just allow people to have more choice, more rights, let them engage in that decision. So I'm not so sure the outcome dependent stuff works, but if it is outcome dependent, I think as I'll come to later, Neg does have some framing as to why that outcome is actually still important to have this extra choice. We then get a second tranche of responses from negative. Firstly being that you don't know who the president is, so having a separate vote for the vice president doesn't actually mean you're necessarily consenting to a split vote, so therefore we're not getting the benefits of AF Neg wants to talk about. I think one that is, I guess, factually untrue in the fact that there has been lots of split votes and people would be aware that they vote differently, there might be like we end up with the split executive, which is I think the response is given by third negative as well. I think the best response we get though is this trade-off that we hear at third affirmative of amount of representation versus outcome. So we don't necessarily give you full representation to vote for everything, so it doesn't necessarily matter if you're getting full representation here versus that outcome. I think that is probably the closest bit. I think Neg could have done a bit more to explain why this extra little bit is the thing that we really need to get over the line. I think what ultimately does give Neg maybe a narrow but not debate determinative win on this issue is a bit of the framing that we hear at Neg reply and at third Neg, that is to say, and to be very clear, it's not new responses, I think it's just putting other stuff in the debate in the context of weighing up against here, and that is to say that in a context where you have an overpowered executive, an underpowered Congress and Parliament where decisions are difficult and cannot be made, it is preferable therefore to give extra choice in this capacity because we have more power in the VP position to fulfill that role of accountability and check and balance that both teams care about that is not present in the Congress/Parliament. I'm not actually sure which is the correct term, sorry, but in the Parliament body to push back against that. So I think maybe then that gives a little bit extra marginal framing as to why this position maybe does need that extra democracy and choice. So I think Neg gets a narrow win on the issue of the principle, but I don't think it's ultimately a determinative issue. For me, far more of the debate happens on the second clash of decision making. Before I get to the second clash though, I did want to talk briefly about this negotiations point because I think that fits more neatly under the democracy. It's about giving people access to information. Because the push we get from AF is that better to have the discussion before forming coalitions, etc. People have that information when they go to the voting booth. To be completely honest, I was particularly confused by this point from affirmative as to what and why negotiations were happening, who was doing them, what was the purpose of that, and I don't think that ever became super clear from affirmative. Because I think the ultimate conclusion, better to have things done before people can vote on that outcome and know what they're doing, is true and good. I think, however, as Neg ultimately points out in later speeches, that it is unclear why, absent the split ticket, any of this negotiation or discussion would be happening in advance, because presumably the parties would be trying to win the election outright, wouldn't be having split tickets or VPs, etc. So I think given that And the next response they give as well is if it is true that they're doing this, that's actually worse then, because the parties are predetermining a more singular vision, which actually gives voters less choice and less options when they go to the voting booth if they've pre-organised what they agree on, and that defeats the two-party system a little bit as well. So I think at that point then, without a bit more clarity about exactly what and why this thing was happening from AF, I think Neg does enough to sort of say that this is not a particularly good thing or a likely thing to happen in the first place. So with those sort of 1.5, 2 issues on democracy, I think that Neg takes those things. Let's then talk about decision making, which is where I think the bulk of the practical stuff happens in the debate. So the first idea we get from affirmative is that the issue with the status quo is there's a deadlock. There's a bunch of reasons why when you have the split votes, nothing can pass. That's because you've got different elites and different voter bases causing conflict over who votes where. You've got parties wanting to act as strongmen and not wanting to like let go of their grasp, etc., on their power, but also an incentive to kind of like stall the other government from doing things so that you can have more power later on. And all that ends up with a situation of less cooperation, less good outcomes for citizens, etc., and poor resource allocation to different parts of the regions. I think Neg does some good responses here to explain why the deadlock maybe won't occur or isn't as bad on their side. The first one we get, not the first, I've got second Neg written first. The thing we get for second Neg is this is probably better because the alternative is a more full set of power to one party who can then just sort of sweep across, which means you're like that I think particularly responds to things like resource allocation, cooperation, etc., because it means that if the alternative is just one group in power, then they can kind of do whatever they want, and that is a worse outcome for fixing and helping both regions. If there is some deadlock, some pushing back, or it means both areas get a degree of funding and a degree of support. The what we get from first affirmative though is this idea about incentives, so parties want to win future elections, and I think this is where the question of does disrupting the government you are the governing party you are vice president of make it more or less likely you'll look good in future elections. I think what Neg is able to explain is that if you are so destructive in that existing government, it doesn't reflect well on you because it shows that you also can't pass things, you also can't lead well. You do want to achieve some degree of outcomes, but also the elites and parties that are backing you also want some degree of stability. So are likely, if they have that much power, do not want to see you like ruining the country by being a complete deadlock on the issues that are happening. I think the less good response is one about third parties rising up. I think AFTA does a good job to say that's probably unlikely in the Philippines. These parties are pretty set in power as the big two. I think maybe the most charitable version of that is you want the opposition party to rise up and beat you by being in such a deadlock. So that's why the presidential part of the party was likely to give some concessions. So I think on that reading, or that part of the analysis, that part stands, but the third party pressure I think doesn't stand as much. That I think all leads into the next part then around criticism and whether or not you are likely to have constructive or good criticism from a vice president inside the presidential campaign here. I think Neg points that you can and you do. I think the example they give that's quite illustrative and useful in this debate is I want to make sure I get the people in power in the right positions, is the Marcos pushing back against the Duterte decision to boycott the USA alliance and causing cabinet revolts, etc. If I've got those names around the wrong way, just flip them in your heads. But VP pushed the president to change position on that, and that power is a good example of how and why that power is used in critique can be used positively to affect a good change that protects people here. And so I think, and the response we get to criticism firstly is this idea that criticism doesn't have to occur from the vice president, it can occur from other groups. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more response here from negative about why this was this criticism wasn't as good. However, I don't think they do enough. The first is, and I'll come to a little bit in a second, to explain why the other groups we're talking about here, like the congressional, the parliament bodies, are likely to not have a significant amount of power. But even if opposition parties are talking about, it is the power to actually do anything about it. And I think they explain that the capacity of the vice president as being in the executive, in the room, I guess the quote Hamilton, in the room where it happens, that gives them more power to actually exercise that critique and engage with policies well, to sort of help both of these both of these areas and locked in groups help well. I think then in terms of the balance between critique and collapse, I think given the previous electoral incentive stuff, that probably means I don't think it's going to lead necessarily to the point of complete collapse of those governments. But I think also, I think it's a pretty decent intuition from negative to say that if this split system had been so catastrophic for policy, for deadlock, for decisions being made, then it seems unlikely it would be continued to be voted for by the people in the Philippines for so long, which probably suggests there is some capacity people in the Philippines are happy with it, there's some degree of policy happening. I think this part here, this last section, is where there was the biggest difference in the panel. I think the people who voted with ACT believe that the check and balance and the capacity to critique and hold to account was far stronger outside than in the VP position, and the way it would happen in the VP position would be more destructive to the government and less cooperative to the decision making. So I think that was, again, check with the panelists afterwards, but I think that was one of the bigger points of differentiation between our views. The last thing I think, and I left it to last, I think was actually quite important on the decision-making point from negative, was a discussion around the context of the way the Philippines operates, which means that it is particularly important that there is more check and balance put in the executive by having this different position of power. So that is, I think, what we hear firstly from First Negative around there being to be a strong check and balance. Because one, the executive power has a lot of concentration of power in the top, given previous coups, political situations, etc. Secondly, a first past the post system means that often the parliament isn't properly representative of the whole country, but also the first past the post often results in the president being the same as the majority party in the parliament. Thirdly, lots of corruption in politicians in the political sector, and also large cults of personality. What I think all that means then is that it actually results in a situation where lots of the structures and contexts of the Philippines don't quite work in a way that achieves the democracy or the decision-making outcomes that we want. And given that all this power ends up in this powerful executive bloc here, it is far more preferable than to have the capacity to have a split vote. That is what people are happy with, to achieve better policy distribution, better policy outcomes. I think at the end of all of that, I think both teams do a good job of explaining why both systems might result in some bad policy and some bad outcomes to deadlock. But I think ultimately, given that context and the incentive analysis, Neg gets another narrow win on showing why it's probably better in this particular context to have the two split votes, and that's why they ultimately end up taking the debate. I hope that all made sense. Thank you all very much for the debate. Like I said, very, very well